2, 1. Good afternoon, Agnis.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Let's
Perfect.
see if I can get this YouTube live thing going. I have no idea how to do this.
Me neither.
This is THS 2. I think so. I'm just going to get in this weird infinite loop if I share my screen while YouTube is zooming me, but we can all learn together. No, it's not made for kids. My son told me I should make sure to check that so it doesn't mess everybody. Smile for the thumbnail. Nothing. Okay. 3, 2, 1. You know, it's funny. I did this when I was doing my startup almost 6 years ago now, mostly just so I felt like I wasn't stuck in a room by myself. I could pretend I was talking to an audience. But I actually had, this is in the early days of YouTube Live, and so I actually had like 5 or 6 people around the world who would tune into me, and I would record it and post the sessions on YouTube. And then actually a friend of mine from college that I hadn't talked to very much started like watching my videos for fun, and we reconnected and ended up joining my startup as a volunteer. And we've been working together on a bunch of different projects ever since. So it's unclear how much impact it has, but it's a thing to do, and who knows. So I'm not sure if this is actually doing anything, and I don't want to waste our time worrying about it, so we can just go ahead and get started. So I think that actually one question I wanted to do just to kind of make this topical is I was listening to a group called Veritas Forum, and they were talking about I'm sharing the screen there, the difference between endogenous and exogenous shocks, and about having our lives run by our exoskeleton versus our endoskeleton. And the guy was an economist who was trained as a classical musician. He says the thing about being a classical musician is your life is you have to be driven by inner motivation, because you have that voice in your head that's always saying, I must be practicing, I ought to be practicing now. And I was thinking about that in the context of our discussion about transformation, right? And it feels like, and I don't know if this is true, that there's a difference between endogenously motivated transformation, like I am not happy with the way the world is, therefore I need to make a change, versus the exogenous view of the world is not happy with who I am, so I have to make a change. Do you see those as two different things, or are they really two sides of the same coin?
First reflection is it's the same thing. I mean, like when we have enough awareness, we realize that everything is the same. And especially when you look at the spiritual speakers, it's all about the only thing that is your awareness. Everything happens in your awareness. And especially when they got down to some topics which might be quite controversial for exact scholars like you and me that have studied material science or engineering. And then they say, like what they usually refer to is, please point me to that thing that you're referring as the world. And there is no way, because you can only refer to your experience with the world. And there is, from that perspective, it's a great reminder that it is our experience. And then we try to make sense out of our experience. And that's why we create these concepts, the world, the material, the matter, everything, because it's something that is shared among most of the people. And again, we know that some of the brains are slightly different, some of the experiences for some people are slightly different, and they might see the same thing slightly different because of their specific, I don't know, conditions and the thing. So it's a very interesting topic, and I think the answer, the short answer is pretty much is the same thing.
Yeah, reminds me of one of my favorite quotes is that the only thing we can be objective about is the subjective. And another phrase that I've been using actually, my first paid startup after mine failed was actually a virtual reality company, actually a reconstructed reality company where they use these cameras in multiple locations to form a 3D picture of a physical space. And we had some interesting discussions about, it's not exactly objective, but it is trans-subjective. The phrase I used at least was the global reconciliation of multiple perspectives. So I can't say that what we're saying is really objective, but it's bigger than just my own subjective viewpoint. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here is, we're trying to come up with like a science of flourishing or something like that. And I have a perspective and you have a perspective. And the hope is that if we can reconcile those perspectives, we can come up with something that is at least bigger than us, even if it doesn't capture all of reality.
I'm in. I'm fully in, because I think that's exactly how we separately have made our journey to a certain point, and then certainly it's much better to connect with other people that have made their way up to certain points, which might be quite close to those, so that we have a conversation about that and get this unified view at least closer to it.
All right, I'm going to take some notes here so I can make better session notes for the next session. All right, so as you may recall, today's agenda was for me to get an overview of your 8 tools.
Yes, so let's do that.
All right.
That means I'm gonna share my screen. Great. And I'm gonna launch the presentation. So here we go. Ooh, most likely you see.
Love the way you rock that bow tie. You almost got a little Bill Nye vibe going on for you there.
Right.
Familiar with Bill Nye the Science Guy?
What do you say?
Bill Nye the Science Guy. He was a science popularizer, children's television show host.
Interesting. No, I don't know, but now okay. I know.
You'll Google it later. All right, go ahead.
And then if you pay closer attention to the bow tie, you might see a specific pattern on it. Yes! That's MIT. MIT logo in its original form, the round one with the man and the book and the tool. So combining the science and practice. So yes, that's a nice gift that I received from my wife at the point when we decided to move on and move away from MIT and Boston, pretty much continuing our journey to my professorship. That was a very nice gift because I already had this tradition, like a signature, having the bow ties when I speak. And that's very nice one.
My first thought was that you left MIT, but it's still a string tied around your neck.
And again, I was saying that word left, and it's not true. I mean, I think it's impossible for me to leave it, just like it's impossible for it to leave me, just like you had this very interesting perspective to open up today. There isn't such a thing that one leaves the other. It's either we have this relationship and we have it, and then it's just depends on what is the content of that relationship, and that changes over time, but it's not that something is really leaving one or the other. So yes, and I still have a very close connection. But
yeah, we used to say you can take the nerd out of MIT, but you can't take the MIT out of the nerd.
That's really great. So I would kind of fit into this description to some degree.
We digress. Go ahead.
Well, this will be very quick, very brief. I would like just to have like a first glimpse of what it is without going deeply into deeper understanding of that at this point. And certainly for making it more practical or understandable, we would like to have an example. And I don't know what you think, but the first behavioral challenge that I would come up with at this very moment is related to the circumstances that we have. And what would be one of the most visible necessary behavior for everybody is to wash their hands, right?
Okay.
As frequently as possible. And of course, the other part is spatial distancing. So you don't come close to other people. But because the second one is rather involving other actors, so it's not having like a full agency on the individual. So therefore, I would suggest for the time being excluding the second one, and then focusing on the first that people can do at home. If they have water, running water, then it's good. And they can do that very frequently. So that's one thing that I would like to just suggest as an example to run through the framework. So here it is, here it starts. It's transformation design methodology. It contains typology of change. It contains explanation of vectoral transformation. And it has the framework with 8 tools. And it's all usually is delivered as the masterclass. So let's dive in.
Okay.
So first
and
of
I'll hold
all,
my questions to the end to give you time to focus.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think that would be the best way. So we start here. I run like a quick run through, and then you ask the question so we can come back at any time to any point. And that would have this kind of 2 separate parts. We have one episode that people can watch like from the beginning to the end, like enjoy that ride, and then we can discuss it. But of course, we can some other time do the opposite. We can take another example and we go like a jump back and forth. So I think for introduction to you and to others, let's do the quick run through. So this is the transformation design methodology, including typology of change, transforming vectors, framework with 8 tools. And the first thing is to understand that there's different kinds of change. There are smaller kinds of change and larger kinds of change. So the first one that I would like to emphasize is transaction. Transaction means people exchange some of their behaviors to get some reward or punishment. And most likely there is a punishment that people want to avoid so that they comply with that. So punishment would be in the case of not washing their hands is actually getting the disease. So that would be the punishment, and they would try to stick with this and doing that. So the second change is transition. That has a period of time. That's also applicable in this case as washing their hands as long as that's required or stated by the president of the country, like it's in some of the countries that say do this. And that's a transition which has a period of time and has an endpoint, which means that people, when reaching that endpoint, for example, pandemic is over and there is no official requirement to kind of wash your hands more often, people can stop and go back not washing their hands. And that's the trick, psychological trick that sometimes trap people in stopping the behavior after the deadline and reverting sometimes even backwards. And therefore, it's important to understand that really transformational change is possible when people continue for forever and then have the new identity that supports this behavior. So in this case, that would be a person who washes their hands any given time when that is making sense. So after doing something or being outside, that would be a natural habit. And the strongest tools that are represented in all of these 3 kinds of changes. So usually for the transaction, the most effective have been proven to be punishment. So people want to avoid the punishment and do it one time. And then for a transition, carrots or rewards are the best. So if there is something promised after you do certain behavior in a good shape, in a good format, and then you get some kind of a benefit. That could be monetary, it can be a travel or something. And then for transformational, to have a contrast with these 2 other rewards and punishments, which usually has a very limited effect on the sustainability of the behavior, I have found in the science that social influence has much more profound long-term effect on change, and specifically on a sustainable format of change, which I call transformation. So we would look into the other people to harness the source of motivation. And then the last thing for this slide is you can see on the corners up there, on the left-hand side, there is artificial. On the right-hand side, there is humane. And what I mean by that, for our brains, how they perceive these 2 types of motivators, rewards and punishments are created by people, and they are externally modulated and then placed into the environment for the people. So therefore, it's rather not that humane, it's more outside and artificially created and placed. While social influence is something that is encoded in our DNA, as I used to speak lately about the DNA and how we react. We react to other people most of the times, even without involvement of our cognition and our rational part of the brain. We just instinctively do what other people do. Just in a case, if you see people running on the streets and there are many of them, you instinctively feel like you are about to run together with them without knowing why they are running. So those are like three types of change to understand that there is this difference, and not to get trapped into misleading yourself what kind of change you are trying to aim for and what motivators are the best for each of these. So the next thing is about vectors. So vectors help these changes to sustain. You see this green thing, like one of your behaviors running on this green arrow. And in this case, if the transformation vector is, I'm the person who is washing the hands every time it makes sense, that's the green arrow. So I always do that. And then if there are other people who are not always washing their hands, but are rarely doing that, their arrow is this yellow arrow that points rarely. And there are people who never do wash their hands, and that would be never. And these are the differences. Depending on your behavior, you are on the arrow, on the direction, on a vector that leads to an outcome on a long run. And therefore, I will show you what happens if people are not constantly, consistently following this new behavior and are sometimes deviating from that, how the vectors explain the dynamic. So you see this green comes and then it kind of deviates a little bit at one point. It kind of moves away from the arrow. And that tells if people just say, well, this was a hard day and there was this kind of difficulty and I didn't have enough motivation, or whatever it was, that means whenever you step away from the arrow, what it geometrically says, there is no way for you to return to the same arrow, because once you have moved away, you place yourself near it, but away from it. It creates a new arrow which leads to a different direction, and that means you are not aiming anymore to where you wanted to be. So you have now chosen a different direction. Of course, you can change those over time, but that's the best way how to make people realize if you want to redesign your identity, if you want to acquire new frequent behavior, sustainable behavior, you just need to be consistent. Any inconsistency will lead you onto a different arrow, to a different direction, and then you will fail in achieving what you want over time. So those are the vectors. And now, jumping into the 8 tools, this is a summary. So starting from the tool number 1, the triangle, and then moving around the circle, around the ellipse, it's curve, metric, and circles. Those first 4, those are orange. And they are in the first phase of investigating. So the 4 tools out of 8, half of them are dedicated to investigate where is the root cause and what's the context around it. And then after that, tools number 5, 6, and 7 is where we start to design solution for that root cause that we found in the first 4 steps. And then tool number 8 in green is about ethics, because once we deal with a sustainable behavior change, with transformation, it has a huge impact on people's lives. So we have to be very mindful about ethical concerns with regards to those kind of designs. And now I will just run through each one of them, starting with a triangle. Triangle explains how environment around people is influencing what people think, that's the attitude, and also both of them influence what people do. And then if we don't see people, in this case, washing their hands, the problem for not washing the hands can be coming from either attitude or the environment, or both. But most of the times, environment is good. Like we have running water at home. So should be a problem. So therefore, if people not frequently washing their hands, there has to be something in the attitude. And let's, for this example, take one attitude that would be as a root cause. Let's say people think it's actually not helping to avoid getting infected. And if they have that belief, of course, they are not washing their hands more often. And that would be the problem why they are not doing it. So that's to explain the triangle. The next is curve. So once we have figured out what is the root cause or the potential attitudinal barrier, which in this case is they don't believe it's related, the hand washing related to the possibility to be infected, that means attitude is very low. Environment is good. So in this case, that circle point wouldn't be actually in a corner where it is right now. It would be more to the right side, where environment is actually good. So there is no problem to get your hands washed, but the attitude is low. And how does it play out? Behaviors happen above the line, above the curve. So actually the tool is named curve, and behaviors are not happening below the curve. So if the attitude is low, even if the environment is good, it's still below the curve and behavior is not happening. So there has to be a change into attitude in this case. So attitude has to be lifted a little bit. So imagine if that yellow, orange, half ball is in the right side under the curve. What we need to do, environment is good already, we just need to improve the attitude, and then the ball crosses the line and behavior is enabled. So that would be the more mapping out where exactly, what's the balance between these two determinants of the behavior, the environmental factors and attitudinal factors. The next thing is when we start to think about what is the target audience and how we will measure the change. So in this case, it's quite simple. So people, the corner up, the left upper part is the target audience. In this case, those are the people that are not frequently washing their hands. So these are the people. The behavior is the present behavior, which means they are not frequently enough washing their hands. And transformation is the future behavior where we would expect they to wash their hands more often. And then on the right-hand side, on the top, we have metric. So what are we gonna measure? And most likely, what would make sense would be average times of washing hands per day. I think that would be the metric. So, and then we just count it. And we even can use technologies that would be saying whether we opening up the water and what do we wash. Today is the what value this metric is showing. So if the metric for these people that are not frequently washing their hands today might be 2 times a day on average. And of course, in these times of pandemic, it would be quite wise to wash at least, I don't know, 6 or 7 or 8 or maybe 10. And that would be future value, which would be down in the right-hand side. So that's the tool called metric. We have to be very sharp. How are we gonna measure that behavior? In this case, we would be counting times of hand washing per day. And then we see the 2 values. Today is a very low value, and in the future, we would like to increase it. And the next tool, the last one in investigating phase is to understand the 3 circles. And I a little bit maybe spoke about them before. So there are green people who would be just naturally following this idea that hand washing actually is helping you to avoid the risk of getting infected. And they would be doing the hand washing 10 times a day. Self-contained, those are the people that have negative attitude. They would say, I never did wash my hands, and I will never do it. So this pandemic is not relevant to me. This would be like complete the red end. And January 1st are the people who are saying they are willing to do that, but their behavior is not following what they say. And that's usually what happens also in the New Year's, after the New Year's, when people say, oh, I'm gonna do read more books or eat more healthier, and then it just not happening after February. In this case, those would be the people that say, yes, there is a risk, increased risk, when not washing your hands frequently. But when we look at their behaviors, it's still around 2 to 3 times on average per day. So we would like to shift them over to the right-hand side, to the self-driven, and then we need to figure out how to do that. And this is, we will move up to the next tool where we will start to design this possible transition from yellow to green. And the most effective tool for that, of course, is the power of the green people. We will come to that in the tool number 6. So when we open up this gate and we make this feedback loop visible from the green people to the yellow people, then yellow people are experiencing social influence, social pull, and that pulls them towards the green people, which is very fundamental motivational tool that is oftentimes underestimated. So now let's go into tool number 5. That's how we start looking for how we can design an influential experience for these yellow people. So first of all, we need data. Data is real behavioral observations about other people around, which means how many other people, how frequently are washing their hands in your residential building, for example, or in your neighborhood. And that would be possible if there is a way to monitor those. Of course, there are these utility companies that could project at least different kind of deviations over this pandemic time. There is maybe increase in the water, but there could be also very specific sensors put on the water as well. But this data layer is about general data flow, unanalyzed. And then intelligence layer is about making analytics so that it separates and it can figure out, okay, we have that many people in a green circle, and then we have that many people in the yellow circle, and that many people in the red one. So intelligence layer is, in the simplest way to say, it calculates the sizes of the circles, so that we know how much power we have in the green, and how many target group, what's the size of the target group in the yellow. And then in the transforming layer is the notion that we need to build that feedback loop. There has to be a channel that projects the green people to the yellow people, that on an instant basis, so that the yellow people would be receiving that motivational inspiration from the green people. So that's the architecture. So the tool is called architecture. We have to have data, real time. Then we have the intelligence separating into the circles, and then transforming to think about channels, what would be useful to communicate green people to the yellow. Tool number 6, as I referred previously, social influence. One of the, I think, most profound motivational tools there ever was and is on this planet is that other people, how we individuals constantly change what we think and do based on others. And there are fundamentally 7 subdimensions. And especially I studied them in my PhD, and I'm using those into the several different designs in different contexts. So those are social learning. People learn from others, just observing how they do it. In this case, kids would be learning how adults wash their hands, and maybe they watch some video on the YouTube that hands can be washed also for 20 minutes or 30 minutes and more carefully. That would be social learning. Social comparison, people compare their performance with the performance of others, which means if one person has awareness, okay, I've done 3 times a day, and there are other people in my residential building that do 5, 6 times a day, they would say, oh, I'm below the average. Social norms means what is the behavior of the most people, or what is the general public doing? So that would be creating the norm. Okay, if this is a pandemic and there are people on average, and most of the people are have increased the hand washing, okay, that's the norm. So people tend to follow that. Social facilitation is the notion that people are more motivated if they know that right now, right here, other people are doing it. And that's why I'm speaking about the neighborhood or your own residential building. So it's not about some other people on some other continent 2 years ago. No, facilitation is when you know it's here and now. Cooperation, it's very natural, so people tend to cooperate. If there is a goal, okay, let's do on average 6 times a day for the whole building. So people start to cooperate to get this average the 6 times a day. Competition, that triggers people to be competitive if they want to do it more often, more frequently, maybe on the individual level, but also on the residential building level, or the neighborhoods can be competing on how many times they've done it. And recognition is a good tool to recognize particularly exceptional behaviors, outstanding performers, and they would like to keep that motivation going, and they would like to keep that title, not let it go. So those are the 7 principles, very powerful, often not used enough. Tool number 7, once we have designed a system where people would be able to see, compare, cooperate, and so forth, this tool number 7 is called moderation. And that's a reminder for designers of such systems or such new experiences that we cannot predict what other people will do. And because we rely on social influence, it can pull us to the green end if we have more green people, but also it can pull us to the red end if one day there are more red people. So for example, there is a one day and people just don't do it. And we don't want our system to revert the effect. And that's the red arrow. So if there's a one day and the system shows, you know, nobody washes their hands, people would start to ask, what's happening? Maybe the pandemic is over and I should stop it too. And that's not what we want. So there's dynamic design that accommodates the behavior of other people coming into the system, and we cannot predict it. Therefore, there has to be a good way to put some thresholds and to tailor the messaging or tailor the appearances of these features into user experience features according to that, so that we don't experience the red pull. And of course, if it's everything is good, then the effect is amplified. If you have a lot of green people, we just do fine and it's amplifying the effect. And the decrease is when we have not this red pull, but we don't have enough of the green people. So it might be making some of the people more hesitant. They think, is it really true? Is it really helping? And they might be like a little bit decreasing their motivation. And now let's just finish up with the tool number 8. It's about ethics. Ethics means that, first of all, we need to understand we are trying to help some people to increase their hand washing behavior. That's our intended, which means on the top, and positive, which means it's good for them. That's the right upper corner. That's our target behavior and our target people. Sometimes when you create new behavior facilitated by social influence through the technology design, there can be that people, once they start to wash their hands more often, they might create some other positive, which is on the right-hand side, but unintended behaviors, which are not targeted. So for example, people start to wash their hands more often, and they start to wash fruits more often, or vegetables more often, which wasn't the target. But then because of the new habit, they create positive other unintended behaviors, which is surprise behaviors. That's a positive. Let's look at the negative. So on the negative side, let's start with a negative effect on the users or the people and unintended. They are called backfires. What that means, some people can overdo it, for example. They can start to wash their hands 20 times a day, 30 times a day, 50 times a day, and then it becomes unhealthy for your skin and actually unhealthy maybe even psychologically. That could happen, and we don't want that. Those are usually called backfires. We cannot really predict that, but we need to know they're possible. And then the last corner is negative and intended, and that's the dark patterns. There have been different collections of dark patterns available already, and there might be that the designers of the system or owners of the system start to abuse for their own good rather than for the good of the users and the people themselves. So that's quickly the run through the 8 tools, and happy to have any questions you might have.
Yeah, so we are running late, and so not much time. I think the interesting thing for me is, I think, putting my physicist hat on, what I want to understand is the core underlying assumptions and models behind this, right? Because I think that's where we turn this from an engineering practice of a thing we're building to a scientific discipline of a thing we're studying, right? And there's several really profound insights, many of which are explicit and many of which are implicit. So I think maybe for our next session, we can try to unpack some of that. And maybe I will come up with my short list of my initial hypothesis of what I infer you believe based on the tool you present. And we can start with that discussion.
That sounds excellent. Certainly looking forward to that.
All right, thank you very much for presenting it. I have no idea if any of this showed up on YouTube yet, but it will show up on YouTube eventually.
Yes, I saw the channel. It looks like a good start. Let's continue. Right. I believe it's a great thing, and people will love it.
All right. Thanks, Agnis. Have a great day.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.